Okay, so Shavua Tov, everyone. We are in chapter 7, the end of chapter 7 of Shmuel Aleph. You'll remember that at the end of last week, we had a very quick review of verses 11 to 14. And I said that we would do that in a bit more detail this week, and I will show you some maps just to put some geographical perspective on it, because the geographical perspective, I think, is, well, I don't know if you find it fascinating. I certainly find it fascinating to know where these places that we're reading about are. And I think it probably, I've told you this before, but I think it stems from the very first time I remember being in Israel, aged 8, and being taken to Hebron and standing in front of the Monarchy, where the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried. And it was really quite mind-boggling for me that I was actually stood at a place where I'd been learning in great detail in school about these things. And it had far, far more effect on me than did the Kotel, which, of course, I hadn't really learnt about, because you don't see anything about Yerushalayim until you get to David HaMelech. And of course, in Jewish education in the UK, you don't learn anything past the end of Dvarim. You might do a first few psukim of Yehoshua if you're lucky, but you certainly never learn any proper Tanakh. So the Kotel didn't really mean a huge amount, but certainly the Ma'arat HaMachpelah did. And I think ever since then, I've had a fascination to actually be stood on the places that we learn about. So I'm going to show you where these places are that we're talking about, just to put it into perspective where we were up to, a quick recap.
There's an email.
Where, oh, I need to put you all on mute, don't I? Hang on a sec. Mute all. There we go. Right. So chapter 7 is where we're up to. The Ark had spent its time in Philistia, causing trouble and hemorrhoids and all sorts. And then it came back to the fields of Bet Shemesh, where it caused even more havoc and thousands of deaths. Then it got sent to Kiryat Ye'arim, where it stayed in the house of this Kohanic family that we spoke about. And then we had the Baal Tshuva movement that we spoke about last week, that Shmuel Hanavi started off, I suppose, in verse 5. He gathered all Israel to Mitzpah, and they did this libation offering, if you remember, with water. And I suggested to you that that was a little bit of crept-in paganism, because there was nothing in the Torah that tells us how to do a water libation. And then we had this idea that the Philistines saw in verse 7. Perhaps I'll put it on the screen. Hang on a sec. There we go. Can have a look at that. The Philistines saw this gathering. They didn't know that it was a religious gathering. They didn't know that they'd all gathered there to daven to Hashem and to offer up offerings and to do tshuva. What they thought that this was a gathering of the troops at the border, because of course Mitzpah, where it was, has got form in that regard. That was where they gathered before they attacked Binyamin. So not an unreasonable assumption of the Philistines to think that this was going to be an attack by the Bnei Israel. And the Bnei Israel cried to Shmuel, and that we had this funny expression, Al tacharesh mimenu, do not be deaf and dumb, and don't stop crying out to Hashem that he save us from the hand of the Philistines. And if you remember last week, we had a look at chapter 4, where we had the Ark being the one that they were asking to save, although both the Ark scroll and the Chabad translation did a bit of a whitewash job and put a capital H, he, as opposed to it, which of course could be either with the Hebrew. And that's where we got to the end of last week. So we then said verse 10, I think we ended with verse 10, and we had this idea of thunder. The Lord thundered with a loud noise, and it threw them into a panic. And we spoke about the parallels there of the noise of the thunder being the same sort of noise that they had at Har Sinai, also the noise of the shofar at Yericho. These are all miraculous things that are conjured up by these expressions. We also mentioned this word vayahumam, they panicked, and although it wasn't in the Shirah, which I thought it was, it is in a description of the panic that the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, felt at the time of Kriyat Yam Suf. So again, that harks us back, if they're allowed to say such a thing, to these activities. And what you can see from here is a comparison between Shmuel and Moshe Rabbeinu. You can see this correspondence, really, that Shmuel is being offered to us as a Moshe Rabbeinu lookalike. He's the Moshe of his generation. And we'll see actually at the beginning of the next chapter, which we will probably do get to today, that we see some parallels with somebody else as well with Shmuel, which is not quite so flattering. And it's all very interesting to see that. And that's where we ended last week. And I asked Leon to read out verses 11 to 14 right at the end of last week's shiur. I said that we would go into that in some detail today, and that's what we're going to do. So, Leon, if you could read out verses 11 to 14, please.
The men of Israel went out of Mitzpah and pursued the Philistines, striking them down until beneath Beit Kar. Samuel then took one rock and placed it between Mitzpah and the cliff, and called it Even Ezel, the rock of help, saying, Hashem helped us until here. The Philistines were humbled and no longer continued to enter the borders of Israel. And the hand of Hashem was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The cities that the Philistines had taken from Israel reverted to Israel, from Ekron to Gat. And Israel rescued their surrounding areas from the hand of the Philistines. Furthermore, there was peace between Israel and the Amorites.
Okay, let's stop there. So those 4 psukim need a little bit of investigation. Let's take them one at a time. And the men of Israel went forth from Mitzpah and pursued the Plishtim and harassed them until they were below Bet Kar. Now, we're not really sure where Bet Kar is, but it's clear. We need to have our famous map up. Let's try and get that up for you. The map that you're all familiar with. Where is it now? I'll put it on my desktop. The problem is I can't find my desktop. Hang on a sec.
That gives you a bit of a description at the bottom of the page, Johnny.
Read it out for us. Read it out for us, Johnny, while I'm looking for the map.
Bet Kar, a settlement on the slopes of the highlands of Ephraim, on the route from the Mitzpah to the lowlands. Some suggest that it is Ras Karaka, which lies on one of the routes descending from Ramallah to the plains, some 3 kilometers south of the settlement of Dolev.
Okay, excellent. So I found my map now. Let's put it back on the screen for you. There we are. Right. So, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Lachish, Bethel, Ai. We have the Mitzpah is over here, the corner of Binyamin, Dan, and Jerusalem. Where those three areas meet, that is where Mitzpah is. So they attacked the Philistines going south, and they reached Bet-Kar. Read that again for us, Johnny. Tell us exactly where it is, please.
A settlement on the slopes of the highlands of Ephraim, on the route from the Mitzpah to the lowlands. Some suggest that it is Ras Karakar, which lies on one of the routes descending from Ramallah to the plains, some 3 kilometers south of the settlement of Dolev.
Dolev, okay. Dolev, let's have a look where Dolev is. Dolev, okay, there we go. I'll just bring that up for you. Right, there is Dolev. Let me show it you. Okay, there's Ras Karka, which is meant to be Bet-Kar. Okay, it's over here. Now let's just scroll out and we'll see where we are. Okay, we are. Well, you can see we're still in that, really in that very much that heartlands of the mainstay of where the Israelites were, in that area where it's just, you've got Dan over here. This is Gush Dan here on the coastal plain. Down here, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, that's the Plishtim. Jerusalem, that's at the top of Yehuda and Binyamin. So you can see we're here in that same sort of border between Binyamin, Jerusalem, and Dan. So they've chased them down to there. And let's go back to the Psukim and see what it says. 1 second. Let's go back to the Psukim. Need to get rid of that. There we go. Do you got the Psukim on the screen? Yeah. Okay. So they went forth from Mitzvah and they went down to Bet-Kar. And then Shmuel, so they've chased them south, basically. And Shmuel took a stone and placed it between Mitzpah and Shen, wherever that is. So it's going to be at the border of where they got to. And he called the name Even HaEzer, the stone of help. Ezer means help. You know what an Ozeret is, I'm sure, if you're lucky enough to have one. An Ozeret is somebody that will come and help you to clean your house. Quite hard to find around here, but nevertheless, you might know the word. So it's the same word, Ezer, Even HaEzer, the stone of help. Now, where have you heard that name before? Where have you heard the name?
In the previous battle.
In the previous battle, correct.
No, I've read that, John, excuse me. I've read that here.
How very honest of you. Okay, so we've heard this name before in the previous battle. Let's just go back to chapter 4. Where did I see to chapter 4? Did I get chapter 4? No, I didn't get chapter 4 already. Let's just whiz back to chapter 4 and we'll see. Is it chapter 4? I think it is, isn't it?
4:1.
There we go. There it is on the screen for you. Now, the Philistines had taken the ark of God and brought it from Even HaEzer. Now, what was it doing there? Let's go back to chapter 4 and have a look. Here we go. Chapter 4, and the word of Samuel. Oh, sorry, that's not doing your job there, Leon. Chapter 4, verse 1, please.
The word of Samuel befell all of Israel. Israel went out to war against the Philistines. They encamped at Even HaEzer, while the Philistines encamped at Aphek. Okay,
now at the time that we did chapter 4, I showed you where these places were. Now, what you will see, you'll have to take my word for it because I haven't got the map up now, but what you will find, and I don't know if Rabbi Steinsaltz points this out, Johnny, you can tell us, that this is a different Even HaEzer. It's in the same sort of location, but it's not exactly the same place. How do we know that? because if you look at what's going on over here, they took a stone between Mitzpah and Shane and called it Evan Ezer, for he said, Ad Heina Azarunu Hashem. Up till this place, Hashem helped us. So in other words, it became a boundary stone. It became a stone which said, up till here, we won a victory with Hashem's help. Now, the Evan Ezer from chapter 4 is where they started out in the battle. So that was already deep into their own Israelite territory. So it can't be the same place. And it isn't the same place. So what this tells us is that this name Evan HaEzer is, like many times we've found in Tanakh, is a name which is a later name. It's a name that came to be given afterwards. So, for example, you remember the story in Sefer Bamidbar where the Bnei Israel were desperate for meat, and they had this terrible ta'ava, this desire for meat. And what did Hashem do? He brought them so much quail that it made them sick. It was coming out of their nostrils, and they were sick of it all. And so that place then became known as Kivrat HaTa'ava, the place where desire was buried, because they no longer had any desire for meat. Now, of course, it wasn't called Kivrat Ta'ava at the beginning. Who knows what it was called? But it certainly wasn't called that because it didn't make any sense. So you find in Tanakh that names of places and also names of people, remember we've talked about this in the past, names of people are often due to things that have happened either at that place or to those people. So Evan HaEzer is not the same Evan HaEzer that we spoke about 3 chapters ago. This is the border of where they got to. And what's really interesting to me is verses 13 and 14. Read those again for us, please, Leon. We're back in chapter 7.
The Philistines were humbled and no longer continued to enter the borders of Israel. And the hand of Hashem was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The cities that the Philistines had taken from Israel reverted to Israel, from Ekron to Gath, and Israel rescued their surrounding areas from the hand of the Philistines. Furthermore, there was peace between Israel and the Amorites.
Okay, now, does that remind you of anything? Jeffrey, I'm going to ask you this question. It happens to be your favorite subject. Come on, Jeffrey, tell us what it reminds you of.
Nothing changes. No, nothing changes. It's no different today, and it will not change. And we're going, this is what, 3,200 years ago, 3,100 years ago, and nothing's changed.
So this is 3,100 years ago, absolutely right. The Philistines were subdued. They came no more into the border, and the hand of the Lord was upon the Philistines all the days of Samuel. And then verse 14, the cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel, brackets, in 1948, were restored to Israel, brackets, in 1967, from Ekron to Gath and their border. Let me take you back to our famous tribal map. Can you see the map on the screen, or do I need to reshare it with you?
It's not there.
Not there, right. It will be in a minute.
Yes.
There it is. Okay, so Ekron and Gath are over here in this area, but all the Philistine cities went back to the Bnei Israel. Which were the Philistine cities? Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza. Okay, so they regained all this territory from the Philistines, pushing them south. This is exactly what happened in the 6-day war, when Israel regained all its territory that it had lost in the battles in 1948. The Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, all of the those cities there were regained. So let's read that pasuk again with a contemporary view. The cities which the Philistines had taken, Philistines were the arch enemy of the Bnei Israel at that time. The Jordanians and the Egyptians filled that role in 67. They'd taken from Israel in 48. They were restored to Israel in 67. All these places, Ekron, Gat, Gush Etzion, where we went to on a tiul recently, and the Gaza, all those Philistine cities, they were restored to Israel, and Israel were delivered from the hand of the Philistines. And then this interesting bit here, there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. Who are the Amori? Who are the Amorites? Where were they? What have they got to do with the Philistines? Any idea?
Are they a country that wouldn't let the Bnei Israel pass through?
And that was Edom, but that was Edom, but they are grouped in amongst all that group of nations. You are right that they are one of the nations around that area. The Amorites, the Amori, were a Canaanite, one of the Canaanite nations. It's one of the 7 nations which we're told that we will dispossess. And here they were.
Read you Rabbi Steinsaltz tells you who they are.
Okay, read it for us, Johnny.
Sorry to interrupt you. Alternatively, Amorites is a general term for all the local nations, including the Philistines. In Rabbinic Hebrew, the word Amorite is a general term for Gentile nations. For example, in the expression, the ways of the Amorites, which refers to all idolatrous people.
Okay, so that is an opinion which is confirmed in Chazal, which says that the Amori were one of the 7 initially were one of the 7 nations, and then they became a wandering, the remnant of them after the conquest by Joshua. The remnant of the Amori, the Amorites, were a wandering people that wandered south, and they lived in various sort of small settlements all over the place. But if you take what Rav Steinsaltz says, which is that it is a term for all of our sort of local enemies, there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. Again, this is, again, as Jeffrey has said, Ein chadash tachat hashemesh. There is nothing new under the sun. This is just a rehash, or I should say what we had in the 20th century and the 21st century is just a rehash of history that's going on 3,100 years ago. And for those revisionists who want to rewrite history and say that we were never there, we have Tanakh to tell us exactly geographically where they all were. So I think that's a really interesting few psukim, because it is so obviously paralleled in modern times that I think it serves for us as a almost as a sort of a charter of our history, and I think that this is how we should view these Sfarim of Tanakh, as a charter of our history and our deeds to the land that the world doesn't seem to think that we should have. Okay, let's go on and have a look at the end of chapter 7, verses 15 to 17, and let's have a look at what Shmuel was all about.
Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He would travel year after year, circling to Beit El, Gilgal, and Mitzpah, and judging Israel in all these places. Then he would return to Ramah, for his home was there, and there he would judge Israel. And there he built an altar to Hashem.
Okay, so if I was to just let you just think about those psukim, and you can look at them. They're on the screen. What picture is painted to you by those last three verses? Anybody? Jeffrey?
A circuit.
A circuit, yeah. And what's he doing on that circuit?
He's judging.
Right. And then you get the impression that Samuel is what?
A circuit judge.
A circuit judge, yeah. And where is his circuit? Who is he judging?
It's Bnei Israel.
Yes, that's the impression I get, that you get the impression that he's judging the whole of Israel, right? We said it before. Shmuel was judging Israel. I'm not sure exactly where the pasuk is now, but there's a pasuk, I think it's at the end of here we go. Here it is, verse 6. And Samuel judged the children of Israel in Mitzpah. That seems to be his center, but it seems that he was judging the Bnei Israel. Now, what I want to do now is to show you where his circuit was, because verse 16 tells us he would go from Bethel and Gilgal and Mitzpah, and then he would go back to Ramah. Now, there's a very nice picture here in this book. I'm going to take off my Techelet background so that you can see it. Hang on. There we go. Now, can you see that map there?
Yeah.
Now, you can see there's Shiloh at the top. You've got Bethel, Mitzpah, Ramah, and then you've got Gilgal, which is just out of the side there. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Out of that, and they've got that little circle of red, which is the circuit that is described in verse 16 of our chapter. Okay, so that's the map that you can see there. And what I'm going to show you now is where those places are in modern day Israel. Okay, so Al-Ram is said to be Ramah. Al-Ram is Ramah, which is where Shmuel came from and went to. Over here, you can read this here, of course, that says Beitin. You can always
The map's not up, Johnny.
Oh, the map's not up, sorry. Okay, let me get the map up, sorry. There we go. Is it up now?
Yeah.
Right. So over here, this is Al-Ram. I'm going to scroll out in a minute so you can see exactly where we are. This is Ramah, where Shmuel, his base was, where he lived. This over here, you can see, if I just scroll up and make it a bit bigger, you can see an Arabic word there. You'll have to take my word for it, that word says Beitin, and Beitin is Bet El. Okay, that says Beit El in Arabic, and that's where Beit El was. You can see where we are. Here's Ramallah, here's Psagot. Let me scroll out and you'll see the area that we're talking about. It says there's an error. I need to reload the page. Give me a second. There we go. Can you see it now? It's not very where are we? It's not a very big area, is it? It's a very small area. There's Tel Aviv, there's Netanya. This is Ramah, this is Beitel. Okay, so that's one lot. Now, here's another one. Over here is Ramah. Over here is Beit El that we spoke about. That's not the one I want. This is the one I want. Here. Right, here is Ramah, where Shmuel lived. Here is Bethel, which was part of his circuit. Now over here, this word Anybody? Can anybody read that word in Arabic? Anybody know Arabic? No, neither do I. But I can tell you that that says Jiljilah. Jiljilah. What do you think Jiljilah is? Where do you think that was?
Gilgal.
Gilgal, correct. Gilgal. G and J, of course, are interchangeable. The Teimanim and the Sephardim, the real Sephardim, they have a letter which doesn't exist in Ashkenazi Hebrew of a J. They're Gimel. They have a Gimel. We have a Gimel, but they have a Gimel. And so that is Jiljilah, is Gilgal. So that was part of the circuit of Shmuel as well. So again, if I scroll out, you can see that this circuit of Shmuel, where the Torah, the Tanakh tells us that all the days of his life he did this circuit. It was a very small area, a very small area. What about our friends up here? Oop, I'm going the wrong way. What about our friends up here in Sfat? What about up here? Gush Dan, remember? Dan shifted itself from Tel Aviv, Netanya, and moved up north to Dan. Remember that at the time in Shoftim, at the time of Pesel Micha, they moved up here. What about all the other? What about all the other tribes that are up there? What about Issachar, Menashe? All we've got here in our little map of Shmuel's circuit, it's a very small circuit in the center of the country.
It's a small circuit in a car. On a donkey, it's a long way around. On a donkey and a cart over mountains as well. That's
probably. Yeah, probably. But I mean, in terms of it proportional to the whole of the Eretz Israel, where remember we had been told by Hashem and Joshua to go and completely settle all the land. So what I'm pointing out is that the Psukim indicate, they give us an impression that Shmuel was, as it were, the Moshe Rabbeinu of his generation. In fact, his sphere of influence was really quite narrow and quite small, because imagine without Ynet and the BBC and Al Jazeera, how are these people up here in Haifa, in Sfat, in all these places, how are they going to ever know anything about Shmuel HaNavi? He's only doing a circuit round here. He doesn't move out of his little circuit. Our Pasuk tells us from year to year, he would go around Bethel and Jiljalah and Mitzpah, and he would judge Israel in all these places. What about all the others? So, and then he'd go back to Ramah, for there was his house, and he judged, and there he judged Israel, and he built there an altar to the Lord. So you can see that the sphere of influence of Shmuel may not have been quite so extensive as we might be led to believe, or that we might insinuate from the Psukim themselves. Now, why am I flogging this, and why am I telling you all this in detail? Because it's important when we come to the next chapter. Because in the next chapter, what the Bnei Israel ask for doesn't seem to make sense on the back of the end of chapter 7. It does make sense on the basis of understanding the sphere of influence that chapter 7 is telling us about, which is very narrow. And let me explain to you. Somebody's got their hand up here. Who's got their hand up? Who wants to ask a question? iPad. That's you, Leon. Your iPad.
Yeah. Well, before, I wanted to mention something before we moved on to the next chapter, but you haven't quite finished, so I'll wait.
Go on. You mention it, and then I'll come back to what I was going to say.
Okay. I'm going back to the pouring of water, which was in fact verse 6 of this chapter. it's strange that that was regarded by, in the note in the art scroll, that it was a symbolic gesture, excuse me, of pouring out their hearts in submission to God. Now, in the last week's parasha from yesterday, pouring of water was mentioned 3 times. When Moses was telling the people not to drink the blood from animals that have been slaughtered for food, it says, but you shall not eat the blood, you shall pour it onto the earth like water. And that's repeated again on the next page. Can't see, it's up there. You shall not eat it, you shall pour it onto the ground like water. And then later on, again, it is mentioned a 3rd time. However, you shall not eat the blood, you shall pour it onto the ground like water each time. So it's as if these pourings of water are like getting rid of something that's useless, pour it away. And yet in our chapter here, it's as if it's a good thing that you're pouring out water in a glorification, if you like, of God. It was rather strange.
I think that's really interesting. And I think, I don't know, maybe I'm stretching this, but I think that rather supports my theory, which I went through last week, which is that this pouring out of water here in our chapter was not a Jewish procedure, that it was an imported procedure from other surrounding cultures. I'm assisted by that in this lovely Koren book that I've got, because it says in there, and I think I might have read this out a little bit of it last week as well. The water libation in which the people poured it out before the Lord is a rare passage in Tanakh in general. No Torah passage explicitly mentions a water libation, as ritual libations were stipulated to be done with wine. Water libations were common in Egypt in rituals to provide sustenance both for the dead and for the gods. So I think that rather supports my theory, Leon, that the pouring out of water is connected to something rather negative, which is the blood, which we're not allowed to eat. So you have to pour it on the ground like water. So yeah, I think that supports our theory, or my theory at least, that this was a foreign procedure which was introduced by the Bnei Israel at this point. And what's interesting is that there doesn't seem to be any criticism of it, which I suppose would be a support for us bringing in all sorts of other ceremonies that we have done over the centuries, which of course we have. We spoke about this last week, didn't we? We spoke about canonicals and dog collars and pom-pom hats for chazanim and all sorts. All of those things are imported from other cultures. So I think that again, as Jeffrey said, there is nothing new under the sun. We're just repeating history over again. I think that's a really interesting observation, Leon. Thank you. Yes, Marcel.
Does that lead us to believe that in fact they didn't drink water in those days? They a bit like in Victorian times, they didn't drink water, they drank beer. So they drank wine instead.
Well, I think that's the case. That's the case in the temple. Wine was definitely used as a libation offering in the temple. Of course, that's where the Goyim get it from. That's where the Christian wine libations, whatever they do in their nonsense with the, the communion and all that stuff. It's all based on the Torah, of course, because Christianity is an offshoot of Judaism. So in the temple, wine was used for sacramental purposes. I'm sure they did drink water. Water was for drinking, but it wasn't used for sacramental purposes until the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which you mentioned last week, Marcel. And that's not mentioned until the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. So originally in the Mishkan and in the first Beit HaMikdash, there is no record at all of any water libation offerings. And I suspect that the water offering in the Beit HaMikdash, the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, was also an imported procedure, tekes, from local culture. Remember at that time, there would have been all the gods of the water, the gods of fertility, the gods of all that stuff, whatever it was, the gods of sustenance. And I have no doubt that if you were to go and do some research on the local pagan customs at the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, just prior to during the Greco-Roman Empire times, you will find water libation offerings. You don't find it in the Torah, and I strongly suspect that the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, of which we are so fond, actually has non-Jewish origins. I stand to be corrected if anybody can find some other sources. David Marks is about to shoot me down.
I think I mentioned last week, Johnny, about, was it Yitzchak Yaakov who poured oil on the stone?
Yes, again, oil, but not water.
Yeah.
Yes, David.
No, I'm actually going to support you with further evidence for Sukkot. The shaking of the lulav, it is definitely got pagan influence as part of a water drawing or prayer for water fertility rite.
Yeah, so I think it's very clear. And what I find fascinating, and you won't find many Orthodox rabbis sort of shouting about this, but what I find fascinating is that if you do something for long enough, it can become acceptable as Jewish practice. But what about the guys that first started it? If I was to come along now and say, you know what, I've just seen a wonderful tekes in some gobbledygook religion that said, you should, when you go to serve your God, you should, I don't know what, something, you should bow down 100 times and roll your left trouser leg up. Whatever, it doesn't make any difference what it is. You'd all say, no, you can't do that. That's avodah zarah, it's pagan, it's come from other cultures. What did the local rabbis say when the first person came along and said, hey, I've got an idea. Why don't we do a Simchat Beit HaShoeva? Why don't we do some fancy tekes in the Beit HaMikdash to celebrate the water festival and to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for our water? I wonder what they would have said. Would they have said, oh, you can't do that. That's reform. That's treif. That's goyish. But eventually it becomes very Jewish, doesn't it? Because it gets put into the Mishnah. And again, it's another example of where we have had a less than honest, let me put it that way, a less than honest presentation of our culture as being entirely based in Chazal, because it isn't. And what it demonstrates is the ability and the correctness of a changing, a dynamic approach to Judaism. Now, the problem that we had was that in the 18th and 19th century with the Haskalah movement and the Reform movement, they crossed over red lines. And when they crossed over the red line, which said, we don't believe in Torah min hashamayim, at that point, anything connected with them automatically became treif. That's not to say that the modernization of Judaism is treif per se. It only is treif when it is connected with crossing that red line. Now, we've had this discussion many times before, and those who opposed Rabbi Louis Jacobs back in his time in the 1950s accused him of crossing that red line. Whether he did or he didn't is another matter for discussion and not for now. But those that were opposed to Rabbi Louis Jacobs and his very modern thinking, their opposition was based on the fact that he had crossed a red line in suggesting that Torah may not be min hashamayim. And that's where the problem was. The issue we have today is that anything which is appears to come from an outside culture is by definition treif, goyish, reform, whatever you want to call it. And that's not the way it ever was at the time of the Mishnah, before the time of the Mishnah, and throughout Jewish history, things changed. Our chapter here that Leon has just reminded us of the water libation is the first time in Jewish history that a water libation is done. And Shmuel HaNavi brought this in. And as we've said before, he didn't just dream it up one day. He's been influenced by his surroundings. Rambam was influenced by his Spanish and Egyptian and Muslim surroundings. He was influenced by Greek philosophy. And of course, we today are influenced by 20th and 21st century Western philosophy. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you don't cross the red line. The issue where, and this is, I mean, those of you who were at the Tikkun Leil Shavuot this year, and we had Harry Amdura, who came to speak to us, gave us a very passionate defense of the immutability of halacha. And I said to him afterwards, I said, thanks, Harry. I've just spent 7 years with this group of people trying to show them that the halacha is dynamic. And in an hour, you have just completely undone everything I've been trying to do for the last 7 years. He took it in good faith, although my wife said that I was rude. I didn't intend to be rude. But I don't agree with Harry on that point. The halacha is not immutable. The halacha always was and is dynamic. And I think this is an example here of this water libation, which is clearly not something based in the Torah, but which is brought in from outside. To give another example, which may be a little frivolous, but it's not frivolous to some. Some of you may be familiar with the Jewish music band called Shlock Rock. Yeah, nod if you know Shlock Rock. No, you should know them, Leon, because they're a cover, a Jewish bunch of Jewish guys from New York who took all the famous pop songs, notably the Beatles songs, which is why you should know it, Leon, and they changed the lyrics into Jewish lyrics, and they're extremely good. I recommend going onto your YouTube and just putting in Shlock Rock and have a little listen. They're very clever. They change all the lyrics to make them Jewish. They use the Goyish music, for want of a better term, and they put Jewish lyrics to it. My own son, Dan, and his friend Yisrael Beanstalk, who's now the rabbi in Hale Shul in Manchester, they played one of these songs in South Africa when they were in yeshiva to a bunch of schoolboys and girls and Machaneh, B'nai Akiva boys and girls. There was a Billy Joel song called "The World Is Burning" or something like that, and they changed not them, but somebody else had written in Shlock Rock, I think, had changed the lyrics, and it was the whole of Jewish history in 4 minutes to this tune, and it's absolutely brilliant, and it had a major effect on these kids. They loved it, and now there's nothing wrong with that in my view. Other people say, no, you can't do that. You can't bring Goyish culture into Judaism. Well, of course, we've been doing that for centuries. as I said last week, the famous Adon Olam tune that we all know from the United Synagogue is based in the German High Church. So we've been doing this for centuries, and anybody that tries to tell you that you can't do that is really not being entirely intellectually honest about it. And I think that this particular episode of this water libation that Leon has reminded us of is a very good example of that. And the end of this chapter, where we have seen, as Jeffrey has said, history repeating itself, or history beginning, repeating itself. We've had this whole cycle throughout the 350 years of the judges. What interests me, by the way, is that Shmuel could have been a judge, couldn't he? Why isn't Shmuel in Sefer Shoftim? Why is he not? The story of Shmuel, what's the difference between Shmuel, Shimshon, Gidon, Dvorah, all the other ones, Ehud, Yiftach was different, we know. What was the difference between Shmuel and all the others? We've already said that his sphere of judging was a small one from the maps that we said, same as Dvorah's was, same as Gidon's was. They were all in the same area, actually, in the central area of Israel. So why wasn't Shmuel in Sefer Shoftim? And the answer is really right at the beginning of our shiurim on Sefer Shmuel, when I quoted that brilliant statement from Rabbi Irving Jacobs, who said that Shmuel was the bridge between anarchy and monarchy. So Shoftim, yes, Shmuel would have fitted in very nicely in the book of Shoftim. He does nothing different to the Shoftim of Sefer Shoftim. He might do it a little bit more successfully, might do it for a bit longer, but it's the same pattern. Sin, cry out, Navi, Shofet, Teshuvah, everything's hunky-dory, and then we start all over again. So Shmuel would have sat very nicely in Sefer Shoftim. But here's the rub. The next chapter, which we will start, and we'll just do a couple of the psukim to start with now and then go into details next week, is where the bridge between anarchy and monarchy comes off. Remember, at the end of Shoftim, we had the anarchy of Shimshon, we had the anarchy of the Pilegesh Begiv'ah. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Ein Melech B'Yisrael, there was no king in Israel. It was a time of anarchy. Shmuel came along, and he really just continued on that same path, really, of a local judge, although it's presented in a way that gives us the impression that he was a more widely accepted judge, but really his sphere of influence was really quite narrow. But then we come to chapter 8. Let's just have a look at the beginning of chapter 8. And we'll just set the scene before we finish, and then go into it in detail next week. So chapter 8, Leon, please.
When Samuel became old, he appointed his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They were swayed by profit. They took bribes, and they perverted justice. All the elders of Israel then gathered together and came to Samuel to Ramah. They said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons did not follow your ways. So now appoint for us a king to judge us, like all the nations."
Okay, let's stop there. Now, here we get to the nitty-gritty of Sefer Shmuel Aleph. Up till now, all of what we've said, the first 7 chapters, could very easily have been plonked on the end of, or been a sefer on its own of Shoftim. Could have been at the end 7 chapters of Shoftim. Nobody would have said, "Hey, hang on a minute, this doesn't fit here." It would have fit beautifully. But now we come to the nitty-gritty, which is that the Bnei Yisrael ask for a king, and it's Shmuel that they ask to appoint for them a king. We're going to do those first 5 verses in some detail next week, because of stuff we need to to go through before we get to the king, but I just wanted to point out to you that here we're now approaching the most important part of Sefer Shmuel Aleph, which is the Bnei Israel's desire for monarchy, Shmuel's reaction to their desire for monarchy, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's reaction to their desire for a king, and of course the events that transpire with the. I don't think I'm giving you any spoilers to tell you that King Shaul is anointed, and then after him King David, and then after him King Solomon. So here is the beginning of the monarchy of Israel. David Melech Israel Chai v'Kayam, something that we sing very regularly. We hark back to this golden time of the monarchy of Israel, which, as I've said to you many, many times, actually was a mere speck in the continuum of our history, didn't last for more than 100 years. Of course, we keep harking back to it because it was the glory days. It's a bit like Manchester United supporters harking back to 1968, isn't it, Leon? That's, it's our moment of glory. Lahavdil. Okay, so this is what we're going to do next week. We're going to have a look at Shmuel and his sons, and then we're going to get into the nitty gritty of the Malchut Israel. And then we will see, as we get into the real meat of Shmuel Aleph, how the Bnei Israel develop as a nation. We've needed everything that we've done so far has been a lead up to this point. So everything from when we started Sefer Yoshua together, I don't know how many years ago, it must have been a good 3 or 4 years ago now when we started Yoshua. We did all the way through Sefer Yoshua. We did all the way through Sefer Shoftim and the first 7 chapters of Shmuel. All of that has been leading up to this moment when the Bnei Israel say, okay, it's time for us to have a king. So we're going to hopefully over the next few weeks get into that. Although I'm toying with the idea of maybe this is a good place after next week to stop and do a few sessions on the Yomim Noraim instead, and then maybe after the Chagim we'll pick up Shmuel Aleph. I'm thinking about that. Any people who've got any views about that, you can send me messages, and then I will garner public opinion and do what everybody wants. So let's stop there with that sort of taster, if you like, in our mouths of what's going to happen in Shmuel Aleph next. Any comments, questions on today's shiur?
Yeah, there's 2 points. Firstly, you talk about the influences of other religions and other peoples on the Jews, but then you've got the opposite thing, whereas the Jews used to often bow down, and now they decided no longer to do it because it was taken up by the Christians later on. And the second point is that this Shmuel and his sons seems to be a repetition of Eli.
Very good. That's exactly one of the things we're going to discuss next week, is the parallel between Shmuel and Eli. And what I'd like you to consider over the coming week is the reaction that Eli gets for his problem with his children versus the reaction that Shmuel gets for his seemingly similar problem. Let's discuss that next week in detail. As for the first point, Michael, that's absolutely right. Bowing down was a very common thing in the Torah, wasn't it? Vayishtachu ha'am, and the people bowed down. We had it in yesterday. We have it in practically every Sedra, don't we? Somebody bows down to somebody. Whether it's Moshe and Aaron bowing down to Hashem, or Yaakov bowing down to Esav, or Abraham bowing down to the Bnei Chet when he buys the Morat HaMachpelah. Bowing down was a very popular thing. It's still popular. Go to China and Japan and they're bowing down all day long. They can't keep upright. and it's part of culture.
Every time they get a gold medal, they bow down.
Absolutely, bow down for hello, for bye-bye, because you just got to know what the different bows mean. But you're right, Michael, it went out of fashion for Jews to bow. And I remember we were never allowed to bow down. We certainly weren't allowed to kneel. If you were kneeling on the floor at home, you got told off. You weren't allowed to kneel because that's what they do in the church. That's what they do. They go to the altar and they kneel down in prayer. Apparently, I've never been, but that's what I'm told. And so what's ironic about all of this is that they got it from us, and now we don't do it anymore because they do it. Now, I'm not quite sure what that says about our psyche. It might imply that we have a lack of confidence in ourselves, but I don't know.
What's the bowing down for Aleinu on Yom Kippur?
Okay, so we now limit our bowing down to very specific circumstances. We bow in Shmona Esra, Modim, and at the beginning of Shmona Esra, and at Hatov Shimcha Lechanu El Hodot, we bow down, but we bow down properly, as it were, on our knees and on our faces only at the Yomim Noraim, and it's become a very solemn and powerful part of the service that we bow down. Of course, we are mimicking the people, because as it says in the Tefillah, and at the time when the people heard the Shema Nichbad, the awesome name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hayukarim and Mishtachavim, they would bow down and they would kneel and they would bow down. And that's what we do. We're copying what they did in the Avodah of the Beit HaMikdash. But generally speaking, Michael is right. It's frowned upon. We don't go around kneeling and bowing down. And there's a bit of an irony there, because the reason we don't do it is because the Goyim do it, but they do it because we do it. We did it. So it's an interesting point. Any other points? That's very interesting. Thank you, Michael. Any other comments? Yes, Stuart.
Can I just say, where does the whole idea of having a king, there's no precedence before of having a king. Is it from Egypt, where there was a pharaoh was a king? You know, where did the idea come that they need somebody like a king?
Okay, can I park that till next week? And if you are interested to look, it is in, have a look in Devarim.
Next week's parsha is very.
It's coming, not yesterday. I said yesterday because I lamed it at Mincha. That's why I said yesterday. It's this coming week's Sedra. Have a look in Parshat Shoftim, chapter 17 of Devarim, and you will see the origins of of where we get a king, because the Torah tells us, or Moshe Rabbeinu speaks explicitly of a time when we will request a king. So there is a precedent for the request of a king. The interesting question is, why did it take so long for that to happen? When Moshe says that when you go in the land and you ask for a king, this is how you should do it. This is what a king's allowed to do. This is what a king's not allowed to do, etc. So there is precedent, Stuart, for the Torah suggesting that we might have a king. And I'll go into it in a lot of detail when we get to it. Probably not next time, probably the time after, because there is a very strong machloket, a strong disagreement between the rabbis as to whether having a king is a positive thing or a negative thing, and whether asking for a king and making a king is actually a mitzvah, or it's just a sop to the people that really want to just be like the Goyim. So it's an interesting question that you raise, and it's going to be gone into in a great detail, but not time now, I'm afraid, because I have to run off and get my third jab. So any more comments before I get jabbed?
I think we say a bracha now, even the Haredim, when they see a king.
Yes, there is a special bracha for a king. I remember Mechel Hafner. Mechel Hafner got introduced to the Queen when she came to Manchester. He was doing his Safrut, and he has a picture. Mechel Hafner has a picture on his mantelpiece at home. Really interesting picture. It's a very rare picture. And this is Mechel Hafner sitting at his Safrut desk. Mechel Hafner, by the way, for those who don't know, is a Manchester dentist who's also a Sofer Stam. And he is sitting at his thing with his quill, writing on a clef. He's writing a Sefer Torah. I think he's writing a Sefer Torah. And the Queen is stood.
Megillah, I think.
Was it a Megillah? I'm not sure. I think it was a Sefer Torah, and I'll tell you why I think. I'll ask him when I next speak to him, but I think it was a Sefer Torah, and I'll tell you why I think it was a Sefer Torah. And he and the Queen is stood there next to him. Now why is that a very rare photograph? Because he is sitting and the Queen is standing. You rarely see that. The Queen stands, you have to stand. Mechel, however, was in front of a Sefer Torah, or at least part of a Sefer Torah, and he didn't stand. And I remember he told me the whole story of it, and it was a whole performance. It wasn't just stand that that's what happened. It was a whole protocol, and I can't remember now. I'll try and speak to him this week, Blinedra, and get the whole story, and I'll tell you about it next week. But it's very fascinating. So yeah, he told me that on that occasion when he met the Queen, that he was able to say that bracha that not that many people get to say in their life. There is a bracha which I don't know it off by heart, but maybe somebody else does here. But we'll talk about it a bit more in detail next week. I'll try and speak to Mechel. Any other comments? Okay. See you next week. Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. See you on Wednesday for the Gemara Shir for those that join. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.